Good morning, students. How are you? Today we'll study story The Prince and the Pauper, Chapter 9, Part 1, page 20. Let's start. But before starting to read Chapter 9, I will remind you with some of the most important points that we studied during Chapter 8. Number one, Edward was strong. When he looked into the soldier's eyes and he didn't run away when the crowd looked dangerous. Miles Hendon stood in front of Edward and fought the angry crowd, but the crowd was big and Miles was only one man. Miles Hendon was one of the king's soldiers. He arrived back from France yesterday. He was on his way to his country house. He fought in France for his country for 7 years. Then he came home and a London crowd wanted to kill him. Lord Hertford climbed down from his horse and ran up the stairs to the doors of the Guildhall. He went to Tom and told him that the king was dead. Now open your book, chapter 9, page 20. Edward, King of England. Miles had a room near London Bridge. He took Edward there. They heard shouts in the streets behind them, but they didn't understand the words. Then the shouts came nearer. King Henry is dead. Poor Edward. He thought of his father. Henry was a difficult man, but he was always kind to Edward, and Edward wasn't with him at the end. The boy started to cry. He thought of Lady Elizabeth and Lady Jane, and he wanted to be with them. Then they heard more shouts. Long live King Edward the Sixth. When he heard those words, Edward felt strong again. So now I am king, he said quietly. Now look at this question. What did Edward feel when he heard that the king was dead? When the king was dead, Edward thought of his father. Henry was a difficult man, but he was always kind to Edward, and Edward wasn't with him at the end. The boy started to cry. He thought of Lady Elizabeth and Lady Jane, and he wanted to be with them. Next, Prince or King, said Miles, you can stay here with me tonight. But suddenly a man stood in their way. So you are here, said John Canty. He took Edward's arm, but Miles Hendon put the boy behind him. He stood face to face with John Canty. Who are you, sir? What do you want with this boy? He is my son. Are you his son? Do you want to go with this man? Miles asked Edward. No, no, he isn't my father. I will die before I go with him. Then you will not go with him, said Miles. Oh, but I think he will come with me, said John Canty. Now look at this question. What did Miles do with John Canty? when he took Edward's arm. When John Canty took Edward's arm, Miles Hendon put the boy behind him, and he stood face to face with John Canty, and he asked him, who was he? When John Canty told him that the boy was his son, Miles asked the boy if he wanted to go with him, but the boy refused and told Miles that John Canty wasn't his father and he would die before he went with him. So Miles told him that he wouldn't go with John Canty. Next, Miles put his hand on his sword. Do you want to feel my sword? It killed many men in France. It works in England too. Canty moved away and they couldn't hear his words. Go, shouted Miles, and never come near the boy again. Miles took Edward up to his small room. There was a bed, two chairs, and a table. Edward fell on the bed. Call me when the food is ready, he said. Miles laughed. Yes, Your Majesty, he said, I will order a banquet from your servants. But Edward didn't hear him. He was asleep. Miles went down to the kitchen and brought food up to the room. He woke Edward. Now look at question number 1. What did Miles tell John Canty? What did John Canty do? Miles Miles put his hand on his sword and told John Canty if he wanted to feel his sword. It killed many men in France. It worked in England too. But John Canty moved away and they hear couldn't hear his words. Miles shouted at him, go and never come near the boy again. Look at question number 2. How was Miles kind with Edward? Miles was kind with Edward because he took Edward up to his small room and Edward fell on the bed and told him to call him when the food is ready. Miles went down to the kitchen and brought food up to the room and he woke Edward. Your banquet is ready, Your Majesty, he said. Come and eat. Edward washed his hands and sat down at the table. Miles sat down too. Wait, said Edward. Stand up, I am your king. Wait for my orders. Miles stood up. Now please sit. Miles smiled and sat. They started to eat. Now, Miles Hendon, said Edward, tell me about your life. Well, my home is Hendon House in Kent. My father is Sir Richard Hendon, a rich and important man and a friend of King Henry. He is a good man. I have a younger brother, Arthur. He is very different from father. Now look at this question. What did Miles say about his life? Miles said about his life that his home was Hendon House In Kent, his father was Sir Richard Hendon, a rich and important man and a friend of King Henry. He was a good man. He had a younger brother, Arthur. He was very different from his father. Now, answer this question. How did Edward feel when he heard that King Henry was dead? He thought of his father. Henry was a difficult man, but he was always kind to Edward, and Edward wasn't with him at the end. The boy started to cry. He thought of Lady Elizabeth and Lady Jane, and he wanted to be with them. With this question, we have finished. Thank you for your listening. Thank you. Hoping you enjoyed the chapter. Goodbye.